The crystalline spires of the Velori Palace stretched toward the purple sky like fingers reaching for the stars themselves, and Princess Selara Veilan stood at her chamber window, watching the sunset paint everything in shades of gold and violet. She had lived her entire life within these walls, surrounded by beauty that other species could only dream of, and she had never once felt afraid of anything that existed in this vast universe. The Velori were the masters of 1,000 worlds, rulers of an empire that had stood for 10,000 years without ever knowing the taste of true war. And Selara had grown up believing that nothing in the galaxy could threaten her people. Her father, Emperor Cain the Wise, had taught her that violence was the tool of lesser beings, that true power came from the mind and from the subtle art of manipulation. And she had accepted this truth without question. The Velori were psychically gifted, able to read thoughts and sense emotions across great distances, and this gift had allowed them to build their empire through trade and diplomacy rather than bloodshed. Why fight when you could simply know what your enemies were thinking and use that knowledge to defeat them without ever raising a weapon? This was the way of her people. And Selara had never imagined that anything could challenge this belief. But everything changed on the day the humans arrived. She remembered standing in the great throne room beside her father as the massive doors swung open to admit the delegation from a small blue world called Earth. The humans were a young species, barely a few centuries into their journey among the stars, and the Velori had paid them little attention until recently. They had requested trade rights with the Empire, a humble petition that the Emperor had agreed to consider as a gesture of goodwill toward a primitive but promising civilization. The diplomatic envoy entered first, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, who moved with the careful grace of someone who had spent years learning the customs of alien cultures. Behind her came advisors and translators, and all the usual members of a diplomatic mission, and Selara found them mildly interesting but nothing remarkable. Then he walked through the door and everything inside her went cold. He was tall for a human with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone, and he wore a simple black uniform that seemed to absorb the light around him. His hair was dark and cut short, and there were scars visible on his hands and neck, marks that spoke of violence that Selara could not even imagine. But it was his eyes that made her heart stop beating for a terrible moment. They were gray like storm clouds, and they moved constantly, scanning the room with a focus that felt almost predatory, taking in every guard and every exit and every potential threat before finally settling on the throne, where her father sat. The human diplomatic envoy introduced him as Commander Marcus Cain, a military adees, sent as a gesture of good faith and protection for the delegation. Military adees. The words meant nothing to Selara at first, but something about the way he stood made her skin crawl with an emotion she had never experienced before. She reached out with her mind, trying to read his thoughts the way she read everyone who entered the palace, expecting to find the simple and scattered thinking of a primitive species. What she found instead made her gasp. There was no clear thought to grab onto, no single stream of consciousness she could follow, just chaos and noise and something that felt like a storm trapped inside a human skull. Images flashed through her mind faster than she could process them. Fire and blood and screaming, and the terrible joy of survival against impossible odds. She pulled back immediately, her hands trembling, her breath coming in short gasps that she struggled to hide from the court around her. Her father noticed her distress and leaned toward her with concern in his ancient eyes. "What troubles you, my daughter?" he whispered in the musical language of their people. Selara looked at the human again, at the way he stood perfectly still while his eyes never stopped moving, at the controlled power in his stance that reminded her of the hunting cats in the palace gardens. "That one," she whispered back, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to control it. "Something is wrong with him. I tried to read his mind and found only madness and violence, and I have never sensed anything like it before." The Emperor glanced at the human with mild curiosity before turning back to his daughter with a gentle smile. "He is merely human, child," he said in a tone meant to comfort. "A young species that has barely learned to walk among the stars, and whatever you sensed was likely just the primitive chaos of an undeveloped mind. What could possibly be dangerous about such a creature? Selara wanted to believe her father, wanted to accept his wisdom and dismiss her fears as foolishness, but she could not tear her eyes away from the human warrior. He must have felt her staring, because he turned his head slightly and met her gaze directly, and for one terrible moment she felt like prey caught in the sight of a predator. Then he smiled, a small curving of his lips that might have been friendly on any other face, but on his looked like a promise of something she could not name. She looked away quickly, her heart's pounding against her ribs, and spent the rest of the ceremony trying not to think about the monster her father had just invited into their home. The negotiations would last for 1 week, and the human delegation was given quarters in the diplomatic wing of the palace, and Selara told herself that she would simply avoid the area until they were gone. But even as she made this decision, she knew it was a lie. Something about Commander Marcus Cain had awakened a curiosity in her that burned alongside her fear, a need to understand what she had sensed in his chaotic mind. What kind of world could produce such a creature? What kind of species could look so similar to the Velor and yet feel so completely alien? She did not know the answers yet, but she would learn them in the days to come, and those answers would change everything she believed about the universe and her place within it. The Velori thought they were the masters of the galaxy, the pinnacle of civilization and progress. But they had never met anything like humanity before, and Selara was beginning to suspect that this ignorance might be the most dangerous thing of all. That night she dreamed of gray eyes watching her from the darkness, and she woke with a scream trapped in her throat, and the terrible certainty that nothing in her perfect world would ever be the same again. The days that followed were the strangest of Selara's long life, and she found herself doing the exact opposite of what she had promised herself she would do. Instead of avoiding Commander Marcus Cain, she found herself watching him whenever she could, hiding behind pillars and peering through windows like a child spying on a forbidden secret. She told herself it was caution, that she was simply keeping an eye on a potential threat to her father's court. But deep inside she knew the truth was far more complicated. The human fascinated her in ways she could not explain. She watched him walk through the palace gardens where the Velori nobles glided with effortless grace, their long robes flowing behind them like water made solid. The human did not glide. He stalked, each step deliberate and controlled. His weight balanced in a way that suggested he could change direction or spring into action at any moment. His eyes never rested, always moving from shadow to shadow, always watching the spaces where danger might hide. One morning she followed him to the training ground where the palace guards practiced their ceremonial drills, and she saw him stand at the edge of the field with his arms crossed, studying the Velori warriors with an expression she could not read. The guards were tall and beautiful, their movements precise and elegant as they performed the ancient forms that had been passed down for generations. Commander Cain watched them for nearly an hour without saying a word, and when he finally turned away, Selara caught a glimpse of something that might have been pity in his gray eyes. She did not understand what that look meant, but it made her feel cold inside. At the diplomatic dinners, she sat across from him at the great table and tried not to stare. While the negotiations continued, around her, the Velori spoke in their musical voices about trade routes and resource sharing and cultural exchange, and the human diplomats responded with careful words and practiced smiles. But Commander Cain rarely spoke, content to sit in silence while his eyes moved from face to face around the table. On the third night, a young Velori noble named Thurin decided to test the human. Thurin was known throughout the court for his sharp tongue and cruel humor, and he had spent the evening making subtle jokes about humanity's primitive nature. "Tell me, Commander," Thurin said with a smile that showed too many teeth, "is it true that your species still eats the flesh of other creatures? That you actually kill animals and consume their bodies for nourishment?" The table went quiet and Selara felt her breath catch in her throat as all eyes turned to the human. Commander Cain set down his utensil slowly, and for a moment his face showed nothing at all. "Yes," he said simply, "we do." Thurin laughed, a high musical sound that was meant to be mocking, and he looked around the table as if inviting others to share in his amusement. "How delightfully savage," he said. "I suppose one cannot expect much from a species that evolved on a backwater world. Amusing primitives, indeed." Selara saw it happen in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Commander Cain smiled, but it was not the kind of smile that brought comfort, and his hand twitched toward his hip, where a weapon would hang if he were allowed to carry one in the palace. His eyes locked onto Thurin with a focus that made the young noble's laughter die in his throat, and Selara watched the human's gaze flick to the knife on the table, then to Thorin's exposed neck, then to the guard standing by the door. She realized with growing horror that he was calculating, measuring distances and angles, and the time it would take to close the gap between himself and the noble who had insulted him. It lasted only a second, maybe two, and then Commander Cain relaxed and his smile became something almost friendly. "I suppose you are right," he said in a voice that was perfectly calm. "We are quite primitive compared to the great Veor." Thurin looked pleased with himself, but Selara noticed that his hand was shaking slightly as he reached for his glass. She understood then that Thurin had felt it too, that moment when death had looked at him from across the table and decided for reasons of its own to let him leave. Later that night, as the guests mingled in the great hall, Selara found herself standing near Commander Cain without quite meaning to. He was looking out a window at the stars, his reflection ghost-like in the crystal glass, and he did not turn when she approached. "You are afraid of me," he said, and it was not a question. Selara considered lying, but realized it would be pointless. He would know the truth just as surely as she would know his if she dared to reach into his mind again. "Yes," she admitted. "I am." He nodded slowly, still not looking at her, and something in his posture shifted slightly. "Good," he said. "Fear keeps you alive. Your people have forgotten that, I think, and it worries me." She did not understand what he meant, and her confusion must have shown on her face, because he finally turned to look at her with those gray predator eyes. "The universe is not a safe place, princess," he said quietly. "There are things out there that do not care about treaties or trade agreements, things that take what they want through force and leave nothing behind. Your empire is wealthy and powerful, and that makes it a target. We have defended ourselves for 10,000 years, she said, though her voice sounded weak even to her own ears. "Have you?" he asked, and there was no mockery in his tone, only genuine curiosity. "When was the last time the Velori faced a true threat? When was the last time your people had to fight for survival against an enemy that wanted nothing but your destruction?" She opened her mouth to answer, but found that she could not think of a single example. The human nodded as if she had proven his point, and he turned back to the window with a sigh that sounded almost sad. "I hope you never have to learn what that feels like," he said. "But if that day comes, I hope there is someone standing beside you who remembers how to fight." Selara stood there long after he walked away, staring at her own reflection in the glass and wondering if everything she had been taught about the universe was wrong. That night she could not sleep, and she found herself in the palace library, searching through ancient records for any mention of the species called humans. She found made her blood run cold. Their home world was classified as a Category 12 death world, a planet so hostile that most species would not survive a single day on its surface. The gravity alone was crushing. The atmosphere was filled with a gas that could ignite and burn, and 70% of the surface was covered in a liquid that could kill you if you breathed it. And yet, humans had not just survived on this nightmare world. They had risen to become its dominant species. How was that possible? What kind of creature could conquer a world that seemed designed to kill everything that lived on it? Selara stared at the data until the first light of dawn crept through the library windows, and she finally understood why she was afraid of Commander Marcus Cain. She was afraid because somewhere deep in her ancient blood, her body recognized what her mind had refused to accept. She was standing in the presence of a predator, and no amount of civilization could change what that meant. The attack came on the 5th night of negotiations, when the twin moons hung low over the palace and most of the court had retired to their chambers. Selara was sitting with her father in the throne room, discussing the final details of the trade agreement with the human delegation when the lights flickered and died without warning. For a moment, there was only darkness and confusion, and then the emergency crystals activated, bathing everything in a cold blue glow that made the room feel like the inside of a tomb. The doors exploded inward. Figures in black, armor poured through the opening, moving with a speed and precision that the Velori guards could not match. And before anyone could react, the throne room had been sealed and surrounded. Selara recognized the symbols on their armor with a shock of pure terror. The Wraith Consortium, a faction of rebels who had been defeated generations ago, and who everyone believed had been destroyed forever. But they were here now, very much alive, and they had weapons pointed at her father's head. "Nobody move," the leader commanded, his voice distorted by the helmet he wore. "Any attempt to use your psychic abilities will be met with immediate death. These neural disruptors are designed specifically for your kind." Selara watched in horror as the Velori guards dropped their weapons and fell to their knees, their faces pale with fear, their bodies trembling with an emotion they had never learned to control. 10,000 years of peace had made her people soft, she realized, and now they were paying the price for forgetting what danger felt like. The human diplomats were herded into a corner with the rest of the hostages, their faces showing the same fear that gripped everyone in the room. Everyone except Commander Marcus Cain. He stood, perfectly still in the chaos, his gray eyes moving from assassin to assassin, with that familiar calculating focus, and Selara saw something in his face that she did not understand at first. He was not afraid. He was analyzing. "You there?" the leader barked, pointing his weapon at the human on your knees with the others. Commander Cain looked at the assassin for a long moment, and then he smiled that terrible smile that Selara had seen at the dinner table. "No," he said simply. The assassin raised his weapon, but before he could fire, Cain moved. Selara had never seen anything like it. One moment the human was standing still, and the next he was across the room, his hand closing around the assassin's throat while his other hand ripped the weapon away. The assassin fell with a sound like breaking glass, and Cain was already spinning toward the next target, using the stolen weapon to fire 3 shots in rapid succession. 3 more assassins dropped to the floor. The remaining attackers turned their weapons on him, and Selara screamed as energy blasts filled the air with burning light. Cain took a hit to the shoulder that should have put him down, but instead he laughed a sound that was wild and terrible and somehow joyful, and kept moving. He grabbed a ceremonial blade from a display case on the wall, an ancient weapon that had not been used in actual combat for thousands of years, and he wielded it like an extension of his own arm. Blood sprayed across the crystal floor as he cut through the assassins with a brutal efficiency that made Selara's stomach turn. There was no elegance in the way he fought, no grace or beauty of the kind the Velor valued. There was only violence, pure and absolute, stripped of everything except the single-minded goal of destroying his enemies. An assassin tried to take him from behind, and Cain spun and drove his elbow into the attacker's face with a crunch that echoed through the silent room. Another raised a weapon, and Cain threw the blade end over end, burying it in the assassin's chest before the trigger could be pulled. "What is he?" one of the remaining attackers screamed, backing away with terror in his voice. "What kind of monster fights like this?" Cain pulled the blade free from the fallen body and turned to face the speaker, blood running down his arm from the wound in his shoulder, and his gray eyes glowed with something that might have been satisfaction. "I am what happens," he said in a voice that was calm despite the carnage around him. "When a species evolves on a death world, we learn to kill before we learn to speak, and we never forgot the lesson." He moved again, and the remaining assassins fell one by one until only the leader remained. The leader grabbed Selara before anyone could stop him, pressing a blade to her throat and using her as a shield between himself and the human warrior. "Stay back!" the leader shouted, his voice cracking with fear. Stay back or I will kill her." Cain stopped, the bloodied blade hanging loose in his hand, and for a moment, Selara thought she was going to die. Then she saw his eyes flick to her face, and something in his expression changed. "You are afraid," he said to the leader, but his voice was strangely gentle. "I can smell it on you." The sweat, the rapid breathing, the way your hand is shaking. You know you are already dead. You just have not accepted it yet. I will kill her, the leader screamed again, pressing the blade harder against Selara's skin. No, Cain said, and he began walking forward slowly. You will not, because if you do, I will make your death last for hours instead of seconds. And somewhere in that primitive brain of yours, you understand that I mean every word. The leader's hand trembled, and Selara felt the pressure on her throat ease slightly as doubt crept into his mind. That moment was all Cain needed. He threw the blade with impossible accuracy, and it buried itself in the leader's eye socket before Selara could even blink. The assassin fell away from her with a gurgling sound, and she stumbled forward into arms that were surprisingly gentle for someone who had just killed a dozen beings without hesitation. Are you hurt? Cain asked, looking down at her with concern that seemed almost strange on his blood-splattered face. Selara could not speak. She could only stare at the human who had saved her life, her mind trying to process what she had just witnessed. Around her, the Velori court was emerging from their shock, their faces pale and their bodies trembling, and she heard her father's voice calling her name from somewhere that seemed very far away. But all she could see was the grayed warrior standing before her, covered in the blood of her enemies, asking if she was okay, as if he had not just performed a miracle of violence that would be remembered for generations. No, she finally whispered, her voice shaking. I do not think I will ever be okay again, because I finally understand what you are. Cain tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to continue. You are not a monster, she said. You are a weapon, a living weapon that your species has been sharpening for millions of years. And I think I am only beginning to understand how dangerous that makes humanity. The human warrior looked at her for a long moment. And then he nodded once. Now you are learning, he said, and there was something almost like respect in his voice. The question is what you will do with that knowledge. Selara did not have an answer yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The universe had become a very different place, and nothing would ever make her feel safe again. Nothing except perhaps the terrifying human standing before her, offering her his hand. The medical bay of the palace was a place of soft light and gentle sounds, where Velori healers used ancient technology to mend wounds and cure diseases that other species could not even name. Selara stood beside the bed where Commander Marcus Cain sat with his shirt removed, revealing a body that told a story of violence she could barely comprehend. Scars covered his skin like a map of battles fought and survived. Long white lines that might have been blade wounds, round marks that could have come from projectile weapons, and burns that spoke of fire and pain and the stubborn refusal to die. The palace healers had never seen anything like him. His biology is remarkable, the chief healer said, studying the readings on her screen with wide eyes. The wound in his shoulder has already begun to heal on its own. His body is producing repair cells at a rate that should be impossible. Sarah watched as the healing beam closed the wound, leaving behind fresh pink skin that would probably become another scar on his collection. Does it hurt? She asked, surprised by how much she cared about the answer. Cain shrugged with his good shoulder, and the casual movement made the healers gasp as readings spiked on their machines. Pain is just information, he said. It tells you something is wrong, and then you decide what to do about it. Stopping to feel sorry for yourself usually gets you killed. How can you speak about such things so calmly? She asked, genuinely confused. You were shot. You were nearly killed. And you act as if it were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. The human looked at her with those gray eyes that had seen too much, and for a moment she thought she saw something, like sadness hiding behind his warrior's mask. I have been hurt worse, he said simply. And I have survived worse. This is nothing compared to some of the things I have lived through. Sarah dismissed the healers with a wave of her hand, wanting privacy for the conversation she knew was coming. She a chair close to his bed and sat down, her elegant robes pooling around her like liquid silver, and she looked at the human with a curiosity that had finally overcome her fear. Tell me about your world, she said. Tell me about Earth and why your people are the way they are. Cain was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 1,000,000 years of evolution. is what your scientists would call a Category 12 death world, he began, and everything about it was designed to kill us. Selara nodded. She had read this in the archives, but reading about it and hearing it from someone who had lived it were very different things. The gravity is strong enough to crush most species over time, Cain continued. Our bones are dense and our muscles are powerful because weakness means death. Children who cannot run fast enough get caught by predators, and the slow do not survive long enough to have children of their own. He paused, flexing his hands as if remembering how they had been forged by generations of struggle. Our atmosphere contains oxygen, a gas that is highly reactive and can cause fire with the smallest spark. We breathe it with every breath, and our bodies use it to generate energy at a rate that most species would find exhausting. That is why you could keep fighting. Selara realized. Your body produces energy faster than ours. You are like a machine designed for sustained violence. Cain smiled at that, a genuine expression that made him look almost human for a moment. We had to be, he said, because everything on our world wanted to eat us. We evolved alongside predators that could run faster than us, swim deeper than us, and fly higher than us, and we had to learn to fight back or die. But how did you survive against such odds? She asked, leaning forward with genuine wonder. We cheated, Cain said, and there was pride in his voice. We used our minds to create tools and weapons. We used fire to keep the darkness at bay. And most importantly, we used each other. We are pack animals, princess, and we learned very early that survival requires cooperation. He looked at her with intensity that made her hearts beat faster. A human alone is dangerous, he said. But a group of humans working together is unstoppable. We conquered our world not through strength or speed, but through teamwork and the absolute refusal to surrender. Selara thought about the battle she had witnessed, about the way Cain had moved through the assassins like a force of nature, and she understood now that what she had seen was only a fraction of what humanity was capable of. Your planet sounds like a nightmare, she said softly. How did your species not go insane living in such conditions? Cain left a sound that was surprisingly warm and genuine. Who says we did not go a little insane? He asked. Humans are capable of great cruelty and terrible violence, but we are also capable of love and loyalty and sacrifice. The same world that taught us to fight also taught us to protect those we care about. He reached out and took her hand, and Sara was shocked by how gentle his grip was, despite the strength she knew those fingers possessed. The truth is that humans are not monsters, he said. We are survivors. Every single person on Earth is descended from an unbroken line of survivors stretching back millions of years. And that inheritance is written in our blood and bones and the fire that burns in our hearts. Selara felt tears forming in her eyes, though she did not fully understand why. I have to tell my father, she said. I have to make him understand what your people truly are. We cannot treat humanity as just another primitive species to be managed and controlled. What will you tell him? Cain asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. She thought for a moment, searching for words that could capture everything she had learned and felt in the past few days. I will tell him that humans are not our servants or our pets or our charity case, she said firmly. I will tell him that you are wolves who have learned to wear the clothing of sheep, and that the smartest thing we can do is make sure those wolves are on our side. Cain smiled again, and this time it was the warm smile of someone who had found an unexpected ally. Your father is lucky to have such a wise daughter, he said. Sara stood up and straightened her robes, preparing to face the most important conversation of her life. Father, she transmitted through the psychic link that connected all members of the royal family. That human is not normal. None of them are, and we need to renegotiate this treaty not as their superiors but as their allies. There was a long pause before her father responded, and when he did, his mental voice was heavy with confusion and concern. Explain yourself, daughter, he commanded. Selara looked at the human warrior one last time, taking in the scars and the strength and the terrible gentleness that she was only beginning to understand. I will, father, she promised. And when I am done, you will understand why humanity might be the most important species we have ever encountered. She walked out of the medical bay with purpose in her step and fire in her heart, knowing that the future of her people might depend on what she said in the next few hours. Behind her, Commander Marcus Cain watched her go, with something like hope in his gray predator eyes. 6 months had passed since the night of blood and fire in the Crystal Palace, and the galaxy had watched in confusion, as the mighty Velori Empire signed a mutual defense pact with the primitive humans of Earth. Ambassadors from 100 worlds sent messages of concern and bewilderment, unable to understand why the most powerful civilization in known space would ally themselves with a species that had barely learned to travel between stars. "They have gone mad," the whispers said. "The Velori have lost their minds and tied their fate to a race of violent savages." Selara heard these whispers and smiled, knowing that the galaxy would soon learn the truth. The Wraith Consortium had not been destroyed in the palace attack. They had merely lost one team of assassins, and their larger fleet remained hidden in the darkness between stars. When news reached them that their attempt to kill the Emperor had failed, they decided that subtlety was no longer an option. They would take what they wanted through overwhelming force. 10,000 warships emerged from hiding and began their advance toward Velori space, the largest military fleet assembled in over a century. The consortium sent a message to the Emperor, demanding complete surrender, promising mercy to those who submitted and total destruction to those who resisted. Emperor Cain received the message in his throne room, surrounded by his advisors and his daughter. And for the first time in his long life, he did not know what to do. The Velori had no military fleet. They had decommissioned their warships generations ago, believing that violence was beneath them. How could they fight against 10,000 enemies when they had nothing to fight with? "We should negotiate," one advisor suggested, his voice trembling with fear. "Perhaps we can offer them territory or resources in exchange for peace." "They do not want peace," Selara said, her voice cutting through the panic like a blade. "They want everything, and they will not stop until they have it." "Then what can we do?" her father asked, and for the first time she heard despair in his ancient voice. Sara smiled and activated the communication crystal in her hand. "We call our allies," she said, "and we let them do what they were born to do." The human fleet arrived 3 days later, 200 ships against 10,000. Odds that seemed laughable to everyone watching. But those who had studied humanity knew better than to count them out. The human vessels were different from anything the galaxy had seen before. Angular and aggressive, covered in weapons and armor, designed with a single purpose in mind. They were not explorers or traders or diplomats. They were asterisk predators. Commander Marcus Cain stood on the bridge of the flagship, now holding the rank of admiral after his actions in the palace had earned him a promotion and a legend. "All ships," he said into the communication system, his voice calm despite the impossible odds they faced. "You know why we are here. The Velori gave us their hand in friendship when no one else would, and now they need our help." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the fire of a species that had never learned how to surrender. "Show them what humans do when someone threatens our friends." The battle that followed would be studied in militaries across the galaxy for centuries to come. The human ships did not fight like any other species. They did not form neat lines or follow predictable patterns or retreat when they took damage. They attacked. Small fighter craft swarmed the enemy vessels like angry insects, targeting weapons systems and engines with suicidal precision. Larger ships deliberately rammed into enemy formations, their crews evacuating at the last moment before the impact tore in the consortium fleet. Boarding parties launched themselves across the void, human soldiers in armored suits cutting their way into enemy ships and fighting hand-to-hand in corridors and engine rooms. And through it all, the humans sang. Battle hymns and war cries echoed across every communication channel. A chorus of voices raised in defiance and joy, celebrating the violence as if it were a holiday. "They are insane," the consortium admiral gasped, watching his superior numbers crumble before an enemy that seemed to welcome death. "No species fights like this. No species enjoys war." But he was wrong. Humanity did not enjoy war. Exactly. They enjoyed winning. Every human soldier knew that survival was not guaranteed, that death waited for them in the darkness of space. But they also knew that fear was just another obstacle to overcome. And humans had been overcoming obstacles since before they learned to walk upright. Selara watched the battle from her father's side, no longer trembling with fear, but with something else entirely. She saw human ships take catastrophic damage and keep fighting, saw crews sacrifice themselves to protect their allies, saw a species demonstrate exactly why they had conquered their nightmare world. The war ended in 11 days. The consortium fleet was scattered and broken, their admiral captured alive and delivered to Velori custody. Their dreams of conquest turned to dust and ash. When the human fleet returned to Velori space, they were greeted as heroes by a civilization that had finally learned the value of having dangerous friends. At the victory celebration, Selara found Commander Cain standing alone on a balcony, looking up at the stars with an expression she could not read. "You seem sad for someone who just won an impossible war," she said, joining him at the railing. Cain shrugged and she noticed new scars on his hands that had not been there before. "War is never something to celebrate," he said quietly. "It is necessary sometimes, but it always costs more than you expect to pay." Selara thought about the human ships that had been destroyed, the soldiers who had died singing their battle hymns, and she understood what he meant. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been burning inside her since the day they met. "Why did you fight so hard for a species that looked down on you, that called you primitives and savages?" Cain turned to look at her and his gray eyes were softer than she had ever seen them. "Because that is what humans do," he said simply. "We find people worth protecting and we never let them go. It is not about politics or treaties or profit. It is about loyalty." He smiled, and for the first time it was a smile without shadows. "You showed us kindness when you did not have to." He continued, "You gave us a chance when others would have dismissed us, and humans never forget that kind of debt." Sarah felt something shift inside her, a warmth spreading through her hearts that she did not have a name for. "The galaxy will learn in time," she said, "that humanity's greatest weapon was never your violence." "No," Cain asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," she said, reaching out to take his scarred hand in hers. "It is your loyalty, and I think that makes you the most valuable allies in the universe." They stood together in silence, watching the stars, and Selara made a decision that would change the course of her life. "I want to request assignment as the Velori liaison to Earth," she said. "If that day comes when you will have me." Cain laughed a genuine sound of surprised joy and squeezed her hand gently. "Princess," he said, "nothing would make us prouder." The galaxy was vast and dangerous and full of species who thought they understood power, but they had never met anything like humanity before. And as Selara stood beside the human warrior who had saved her life and her people, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The future was uncertain, but with humanity at their side, the Vori would face it without fear. Because they had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes the most terrifying monsters make the very best friends.